Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're doing something really cool. We're going to decode a fascinating 2,000-year-old method that the Catholic Church has used to preserve incredibly complex truths across generations. But we aren't just doing a history lesson here. We're actually going to explore how this ancient blueprint directly applies to something very current, the modern frontier of artificial intelligence. I mean, right now, we're all wrestling with AI systems that hallucinate facts, operate in these total black box logic loops, and sometimes give us very confident yet completely wrong answers. Well, it turns out that solving these very modern tech problems might actually require looking back at a surprisingly ancient framework.
Okay, let's just dive right into this by asking a super practical question. How does a vital message survive centuries without turning into, cheese gloves canoe, like a childhood game of telephone gone horribly wrong? Think about it for a second. When humans pass information along, it almost always degrades. Details get lost, errors creep in, the core meaning shifts entirely. And yet, the source material we're looking at today argues that there is a highly specific method to successfully preserve core teachings for 2 millennia without losing the main message. How on earth is that actually possible?
So here is our roadmap for unpacking this blueprint. 1. The longest game of telephone. 2. The faithful transmission checklist. 3. A proof of concept looking at the Trinity. 4. AI is the new receiver. And 5. Teaching so understanding survives.
All right, part 1, the longest game of telephone.
Passing on knowledge isn't just an exercise in institutional memory. It's this profound act to ensure the next receiver gets the truth clearly, rather than a confused mess. And to do this, you can't just rely on one dusty book. It requires a complete, living architecture. We've got 4 main pillars working together here. First, Scripture provides the foundational, primary source text. Next, tradition acts as the lived context and continuous practice over time. Then you have the councils, which step in to officially define important terms when debates pop up, essentially building fences around the truth so you don't fall off the edge. And finally, the liturgy weaves all these teachings into the daily and weekly rhythms of life, so they're constantly repeated and internalized. It's an entire ecosystem, right? Designed to receive, preserve, clarify, and hand on the truth so that anyone, anywhere, can easily trace a concept all the way back to its absolute origin.
Let's move on to part 2, the fateful transmission checklist. This checklist is basically the practical core of the whole framework. It's a specific, repeatable discipline that stops teachings from becoming disconnected theological dodgeballs randomly hurled at a learner. Step 1. Begin with primary sources. Always ground the idea in the original text. Step 2. Define important terms so everyone is using the exact same vocabulary. Step 3 is preserving the historical context, because you have to know what the words meant when they were actually written. Step 4 is preserving provenance and lineage, which means showing exactly how the idea was handed down over time. Now, step 5 is absolutely crucial, making your reasoning visible so the intermediate steps are obvious to anyone who looks. Step 6 is clarifying essential principles to separate the core truth from mere opinions. And then we arrive at step 7, confirming independent recovery. This is the ultimate test. It means that based on the evidence, citations, and visible reasoning you provided, someone completely new could reconstruct the entire concept themselves without just having to take your word for it.
The contrast between doing this well and doing this poorly is just massive. Good teaching leaves a clear trail of breadcrumbs back to the source. Bad teaching drops a mystery meatball on the table and demands blind trust. As the author brilliantly notes, bad teaching acts like a fog machine with homework. It literally leaves the learner completely lost in the woods with no way to verify what they're being told. The ultimate goal of communication is to leave the light on and the trail beautifully labeled.
Part 3. Proof of concept, the Trinity. Let's look at a rapid-fire case study to see exactly how this checklist protected a highly complex doctrine over hundreds of years. Notice how the concept moved chronologically. It started with the primary source in Scripture, specifically Christ's baptismal commands in the 1st century. Then, by the 4th century, the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople stepped in. If we think back to our checklist, this was the act of defining important terms. They provided precise language, effectively putting guardrails on a dangerous mountain road so the core truth wouldn't fall into a ravine of misunderstanding. Finally, this flowed into clear, modern summaries in the Catechism, which clarifies those essential principles for everyday learners. The entire lineage is completely visible, continuously documented, and easily recoverable by anyone willing to just follow the breadcrumbs. Which brings us to part 4, AI, the new receiver. Before we get into the pure technology of artificial intelligence, we really need to look at the underlying philosophy of how learning actually happens. The paper draws heavily on the pioneering educator Maria Montessori.
She reminds us that true learning requires a prepared environment and gentle guidance so a person can grow from within, rather than just being stuffed full of isolated facts. Think about how modern AI language models currently operate. Right now, they often act exactly like an imposing adult. You ask a question, and the AI just hands over a final, polished answer without showing any of its work or where it got the information. It imposes itself. And in doing so, it extinguishes creative impulses and genuine understanding because the user literally cannot verify the path it took to get there.
If we want artificial intelligence to be useful for complex truth, we absolutely must avoid the toaster professor trap. A machine can easily generate fluent, authoritative, but entirely disconnected paragraphs. It shouldn't act like a know-it-all making definitive declarations from the kitchen counter. Instead, a well-designed AI needs to act like a highly capable, helpful library assistant. One that doesn't just give you a blanket answer, but actually walks you through the stacks and points you back to the actual authoritative sources.
Translating this ancient framework into modern engineering gives us a very clear set of design principles for AI. A faithful AI system must serve the user by leaving that verifiable trail. First, retrieval before generation. In modern AI terms, this is much like a retrieval-augmented generation pipeline. The system must actually retrieve reliable source documents before it starts predicting the next word in a sentence. Second, it must provide primary source citations. Third, it needs to track exactly where its definitions come from. Fourth, it must make its reasoning visible so you can see the logic steps it took to arrive at the output. And fifth, doctrinal classification, which simply means the AI must clearly distinguish between an official, settled teaching and what is just an open question or ongoing debate. All of these principles work together for one big goal, allowing you, the user, to reconstruct the understanding completely independently.
And finally, Part 5, Teaching so Understanding Survives.
Whether we're talking about a beautifully sunlit Montessori classroom or a modern AI chat interface, teaching ultimately succeeds only when the understanding survives the teacher and becomes a living inheritance. When older children teach younger ones, they're forced to analyze, break down, and rationalize what they know. The understanding survives and takes root precisely because the path of meaning was carefully preserved, completely transparent, and generously shared.
Faithful transmission is, at its core, an act of charity. Love actually desires the next person to receive what has been received. Think about that for a moment. Love doesn't hide the truth. It doesn't throw facts around like a raccoon in a drawer, leaving a confusing mess for someone else to try and sort out. And it certainly doesn't demand blind obedience without offering context. True care for the learner means leaving the light on and making sure the trail is beautifully, meticulously labeled so the next person can easily see the path forward.
So, I want to leave you with this final thought to consider for your own life. When you explain things, whether that's to your kids, your colleagues, or your students, do you leave a trail back to the source? Think about how you hand down knowledge today and ask yourself, does your teaching truly allow the next person to independently see the path for themselves? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Remember, always leave a trail.